Caramel apples, the night before Nightmare Night. A bat flew across the face of a monstrous harvest moon, its leathery wings sweeping through the chill autumn mist, leaving swirls and spirals in its wake. The creature of the night flew back and forth, eating the last bugs of the season. Fat as it was, the bat would need every scrap of weight it could put on before the harsh winter months. Already a few of its fellows had secluded themselves in caves and hollow trees, snug and plump, lost in the half-sleep that would last until spring. A moth stirred from the grass, its gossamer wings making it as pale as a ghost in the moonlight. A quick snap of its tiny jaws and the mouthful was gobbled down. With a surge of its wings, the bat flew on into the night. As it neared a barn blazing with light, the creature became somewhat curious. Usually at this time of night, the barn would be empty, dark and inviting for one of its own. Instead, the bat could hear the sounds of ponies busily working inside. It would have flown closer for a better look, but a sudden chill down its spine made it think twice. An instinct that barely it even understood screamed loud and clear in its tiny bat head. Danger. Best to move on and find more prey. Best to find a safe spot to sleep in the deep, dreamless sleep of hibernation. Best to go far, far from here to do it. There's nothing here for a tiny bat. Nothing but death. Apple Bloom, called Applejack, putting the last batch of caramel apples on a tray lined with waxed paper to cool. Benches set up in the barn lined the walls, half filled with the sugar-coated fruit. "Where has that filly gone off to?" she muttered to herself. A cauldron half empty, but for the hissing pile of sweet brown syrup cooled over by the smoldering coals just outside the barn door. The barn itself was warm and snug, filled with lantern light and the sweet scent of sugary treats. Quite the contrary to the chill night outside. Even so, Applejack couldn't help drawing the cool air into her lungs with a satisfied smile as she stepped up to look for her sister. She loved this time of year. Winter would be here soon enough. It was true, and that had its own work and worry, just like spring and summer. But the autumn months, after the harvest, were the time of relaxation and fun for the Apple family. With the crops in, safe and sound, money would come rolling into Sweet Apple Acres before long. It was a tradition in their family to share the wealth, and what better way than to provide all kinds of apple-themed treats and games for the kiddies for Nightmare Night. Nightmare Night. It was the first holiday that came after the harvest, so the Apple family always did it big. Of course, the holiday had always been more about treats than tricks at Sweet Apple Acres. Every year, Granny Smith would have tubs set up in Ponyville for the townsfolk to bob for apples. She had taken to turning it in early and letting Applejack make sure everything stayed full of crisp, delicious apples. Even so, Granny Smith was still an important part of the festival. Every year since Big Mac was old enough to pull a plow, he'd offer hay rides for the community as well. Even Apple Bloom seemed to be taking more interest in the festivities. Last year she had gone around with Pinkie Pie collecting candy with her friends, but this year she seemed really interested in helping Applejack make a few homemade treats to pass out at the festival in town. A few of the recipes Apple Bloom was trying seemed a mite odd, but Applejack didn't mind trying new things so long as they were able to finish making their batch of usual treats in town. The only problem was, after helping Applejack spear a few apples and dip them in the bubbling caramel, Apple Bloom seemed to completely lose interest and wandered off to do her own thing. Really, Applejack shouldn't have been surprised. Apple Bloom had the habit of getting distracted by the least little thing. They should have been done making treats hours ago, but as it was, she still had about half the apples left to dip. Worse, she was running low on caramel and firewood. "Apple Bloom," called Applejack again as she went to the side of the barn where the wood pile was kept to get a few fresh sticks. "Where you run off to? Get your flank back here, missy. We got a lot of apples left to dip before we store 'em in the barn to dry. And we're going to be burning the midnight oil with all your dilly-dallying." The country pony paused and listened. The fog that curled through the orchard tonight did strange things to the familiar sounds of the farm, muffling noises that Applejack would normally find comforting and amplifying those that she couldn't identify. She didn't hear the sound of any tiny hooves coming her way, Nor did she hear her little sister's voice calling out in response. What she thought she heard was giggling. High, girlish giggling just on the edge of her hearing. It wasn't something any pony wanted to hear all alone on a dark night. Easy, girl. You're just spooking yourself. Applejack reassured herself under her breath as she quickly piled a few dry branches on her back for the fire. She really wished that Granny Smith didn't go to sleep so early and that Big Macintosh wasn't in town helping set up for tomorrow's festivities. More than anything, she wished Apple Bloom would stop wandering off on her own. A farm was no place for a young filly to go exploring by herself, especially at night. Applejack had heard far too many horror stories of colts playing around on farm equipment and hurting themselves. Perhaps more dreadful were the stories of fillies falling into old sinkholes or boarded up wells and no pony finding them until months later, if they ever found them at all. A thought suddenly occurred in Applejack as she headed back towards the barn. Apple Bloom, you better not be playing a trick on me. It ain't Nightmare Night just yet. When she had no answer, she tried. I'll tell Big Macintosh on you. There was still no answer. At least no answer she wanted to acknowledge more than being a figment of her imagination. As she rounded the side of the barn, a sudden burst of flame whooshed into life, painting the fog bright orange. Applejack jumped back, the firewood she carried on her back scattering at her hooves. She almost bolted then and there, but calmed down when she realized the flames were from under the cauldron. Some pony had gotten the firewood again, while she had been out back by the woodpile. Had Apple Bloom gone to fetch more wood, and she missed her going around the other side of the barn? As Applejack drew closer, she saw that whoever had built up the fire had used too much fuel. The flames were licking up at the side of the cauldron, bright and hungry. Although she could see the caramel that had been left in the pot was bubbling up, at this rate it would burn and blacken, completely going to waste. Oh, Apple Bloom. Sweetie, you can't use that much wood. You need a low heat for this kind of treat. She went to drag the cauldron out of the fire and save what she could of the caramel, careful to avoid the leaping, flickering flames, but the old pot wouldn't budge. It was usually only heavy when it was full, not half empty like this. Applejack did the best she could, tugging the cauldron inch by inch away from the barn. Once it was on a patch of damp dirt, she went about kicking sand over what flames she could, trying to tame the wildfire. The flames subdued a bit, so Applejack decided to try and get her sister's help to get the cauldron back in place. Apple Bloom, you in here? Said Applejack as she cantered into the barn. The lanterns had all been blown out by the light from the fire. Applejack could tell that the barn was empty from the inside. Empty as it was, save for the pile of sticky popsicle sticks that used to have caramel apples on the end, sitting boldly on the benches. Even the apples that hadn't been dipped yet were missing. A tiny voice, a girl's voice, whispered, "Hungry," then giggled sweetly. So that's what was going on. Apple Bloom, I can't believe ya. Those treats were for tomorrow to share with all the fillies and colts that came looking for sweets to bite. How could you and your friends be so selfish as to eat the lot before they even had a chance to dry? Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo had to be in on this. Sweet Apple Acres produce might be good enough for a filly to want to try and eat a whole bushel in one go, but one filly couldn't have eaten all the apples Applejack had dipped. Even 3 managing it was a stretch, but that was the only logical conclusion she could come up with. Apple Bloom, get out here, missy, you and your friends, or I swear I'll be writing to Celestia a letter about how I learned to break fillies' rumps with my bare hooves. Still, there was nothing but silence. Well, almost. There was that high, girlish giggling again. It sounded like it was coming from the cauldron, but that couldn't be right. It didn't make any sense. How could there be girls hiding in that bubbling hot mess? Applejack moved tentatively towards the cauldron, her eyes darting back and forth. Beyond the glow of the fire, there was nothing but darkness, mist, and fading moonlight. The smoke that partially quenched fire burned her eyes as she looked into the big black pot, ready to jump back at the first sign of a trick. She froze. Her eyes locked on the sad, shriveled-up figure curled into a ball at the bottom of the pot. She was completely covered in bubbling brown sugar. Even so, Applejack could tell right away that that tiny figure was her sister. She screamed. Applejack reached into the cauldron with her bare hooves, burning her limbs on the still-hot metal as she closed them around Apple Bloom's unmoving form. The pain from her seared flesh nothing compared to the agony that tore at her heart. How had this happened? How had her sister fallen in? Why hadn't she cried out? Why hadn't she screamed? Applejack ran into the barn where there was a trough of water and quickly dunked Apple Bloom's body into the cold liquid. The caramel was already starting to set on this, and the sticky gunk wouldn't come off. Applejack did what best she could, but part of her knew it was already too late. Her sister wasn't breathing. She tried hammering on her tiny chest, put her mouth to her sister's, and breathed air into her lungs, but it did nothing but leave a sickly sweet taste in her mouth, pieces of half-dried caramel sticking to her lips. That was too much for her. She fell back onto her haunches, wiping at her mouth with her hoof, trying to get rid of the taste of candy and death. She felt her gorge rise as tears prickled at the corners of her eyes. How could this have happened? She blamed herself. What kind of a horrible sister was she? That's when she heard the laughter again. It filled the barn, vibrating through the straw beneath her flank, and seemed to echo into her chest, inside her head. There were words, too, in a childish sing-song voice. "Nightmare night, what a fright." Applejack got back up, wildly turning her head back and forth, trying to find the source of the song and the horrible mocking laughter. "Where are y'all? Who are y'all? Did you do this? Did you do this to Apple Bloom?" Applejack howled anger and tears and sadness spilling from her eyes. "What did my sister ever do to deserve this?" She backed slowly out of the barn, away from her sister's body, whipping her head around to try and find the source of the laughter. Where was the laughter coming from? She stumbled out into the cool night air, still reeling from what had happened to her sister, still haunted by the childish laughter she couldn't see. If she had watched where she was going, she might not have tripped over a well-placed hoof. She didn't realize she had stumbled into the fire until flames were chasing through her tail and flicking up her mane. Panicked beyond all reason, she reeled back on her hind legs and fell right into the still cooling cauldron. She screamed then, loud enough to wake the dead, as her flesh burst and blistered from the heat, and the sticky caramel seeped into her wounds. Everywhere the metal of the pot had touched, a layer of skin stuck, sizzling and smoking as it parted from the rest of her body. Blinded by the smoke of her own flesh burning and the stench choking her, even as she fought for more air in which to scream, she tried desperately to climb out of the cauldron. The sides, slick with her own blood, slipped beneath her painful stumbling. The giggling rose all around her, the laughter loud and menacing. A face peered out from the smoke. It was huge, its eyes pinwheels of madness, its sharp teeth pointed. "Give us something sweet to bite," it sang gleefully, as it lunged forward. Applejack felt those sharp teeth close around half of her face. One eye went dark as it popped between a pair of sharp fangs. Her screech faded into a gurgle as the monster ripped away part of her face and throat, chewed and then swallowed the bloody wad of flesh. With a burst of adrenaline, Applejack managed to scamper out of the cauldron and crumble to the earth. She felt something crack as she hit the dirt, but that didn't matter. She had to run. She had to get away. She couldn't get up properly, but she dragged herself through the dirt. A mad idea seized her. If she could get to the barn, just close the barn door, she could buy herself some time to think. Just to think. Tears spilling from her one remaining eye, she labored onto the earth. The few feet between the fire and possible safety now seemingly miles. Any moment she expected the monster's teeth to find her again. With mild disbelief, Applejack tumbled into the barn and slammed the door behind her. She panted heavily, finding it hard to suck air into lungs when a hole had been through her throat. She started coughing uncontrollably, suffocating on her own blood in terror. Something slammed into the door behind her like a freight train, making her shriek and whimper. The door splintered as laughter shook the frame of the entire barn. She stood on her hind legs, with her back to the barn door, bracing her burnt and melted limbs against the door and the slippery straw-covered floor as best she could. This couldn't be happening. She couldn't handle something like this on her own. She needed help. She needed help right now. As she opened her mouth to scream again, this time as loud as she could to call for help, she felt something suddenly thrust between her jaws. It all was happening as if in slow motion. The wooden door blossomed, opening like a rare red flower, all spines and petals gaping wide as if to entice a lover. Shards and shrapnels shred open Applejack's back, sending a shower of scarlet splurting from her that splashed against the barn door in a pattern that looked almost like wings. She never had time to register the pain as the thing that caused the hole, something large and cylindrical, was forced clean through her back and through her rib cage, and into her mouth from her throat. She couldn't tell what it was at first, but the taste of dirt and thence post mixed with her own blood as the sharp end skewered her tongue. The post that had so recently been buried in the earth transfixed her as it poked up through her throat and deep inside of her guts. She felt her teeth break and her jaw pop loose from the rest of her skull. With another forceful shove, the post shattered the door behind her as the creature began to force its own body through. She felt parts of her she'd never felt before burst within her own body, as the thick shaft of the wood churned her internal organs to mush. The monster, whatever it was, tore through the barn door through what looked like the barn door like it was tissue paper, a look of triumph on what she could see on its twisted face. She didn't even feel the shards of wood embedded in her back anymore, only the wood that had impaled her. It was almost a relief when her burning lung collapsed and the rhythm of her heart slowed, stuttering its final beats. The last thing that flickered across her conscience before she died was the figure rising her into the air, giggling all the while, and then taking another bite into the caramel-coated Applejack. "Why is it so cold, Mummy?" "It's been cold like this for the last few years, dear heart. You know that. Those Pegasi have been trying to freeze us out, thinking we give 'em more food if we make it harder for us. But we'll show 'em Earth ponies are made of sternest stuff." "Pegasi? Are you harping on about that again, sweetie?" "Well, dear, you said yourself when you're out plowing the fields with my brother that you've seen 'em darting about in the clouds above." "Aye, trying to figure out what those high and mighty unicorns have been doing to make it snow and cold all the time. You mark my words, those Pegasi are as stumped as us about all this. It's magic that's in those clouds, and magic is what's bringing this unnatural cold upon us." Could the unicorns make them go away, Daddy? Could they make it stop being cold?" "They can do anything, love. Anything at all. Why, just a fortnight ago, while I and your uncle were out delivering our tithe, I seen one of them fancy unicorns take some of our produce and put it in a box, powered by magic as it was. One end went in strawberries and the other out popped some strange creamy concoction that was as cold as any snowdrift. Ah, you and your tales. You'll be giving her ideas that those hornheads are all powerful next. Their hooves are in the dirt as much as ours, but they act even higher in the clouds than the Pegasi. Not so different from us Earth ponies, that lot. They always be putting on airs. We don't need 'em spreading your propaganda for them." "But it's true. He ran something called a sweets shop. Told me to stop in with my daughter next time I was in town and he'd give her a treat." "Next time you're in town? Do you mean the city, Daddy? The castle? Oh, I've never been. You know how much I wanted to go, Daddy, to see the high lords and ladies." "Yes, well, your dad and I will have a talk about all that. Get on with your chores, step lively. Brisk work of the limbs will do wonders to keep the chill out of your bones." And that was Something Sweet to Bite by Knackerman. It's one of my favorite My Little Pony Grimdark fanfics. It has been done much better than I could have ever done. By Umogok? I believe that's how you say there. name. But I wanted to try my own spin at it. So, there it is. And I have, instead of doing artwork that relates to it, I just decided to draw a bunch of my sonos and put it in the background as something that you can just kind of watch and listen to. Or mute it and just watch me draw. You wouldn't be hearing this if you did that, but that's alright. That's fine. I will try to get the rest of this fic out as soon as possible. I have been doing college classes, so it's been harder for me to make fan art. Well, not fan art, just art in general. So, I may be doing commissions up on my next video, because I have been getting those, surprisingly. They're open. If you're watching this and you want one, hit me up. On Twitter at ShinySlurpuff with a little... I'll put in a little thing for it. Alright, that's all. Bye.